Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar for Procurement Systems that fire on all cylinders. I'm Emily Chappell, I'm from Grosvenor Performance Group, I'm a senior consultant there, and I would like to pass on to Stefan and Jason. They are my two colleagues from Grosvenor, as well as Joe, who's from Progressive Systems. So thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I just want to introduce the panel. So if we go to the next slide, Em, please.
Sorry.
My name is Stefan Gassner. I'm a director and head of the procurement advisory practice over at Grosvenor. And I've got Jason with me today. Jason, did you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure, thanks, Stefan. I better unmute first to do that. Hi, everyone. Great to be joining you today. As Stefan mentioned, I'm an associate director with Grosvenor. Just joined the business back in August, working specifically in the procurement advisory practice. My background, the last 10 years, I've been in the procurement world, mostly in financial services, 3-year stint at Combank, 4-year stint at Westpac. And running my own consulting practice in between those times. So I look forward to discussing this topic with everyone today.
Thanks, Jason. And then we got Joe Bailey with us as well. Joe, did you want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm a managing director for Progressive Systems. Myself and my very clever team at Progressive Systems has a wealth of experience in e-procurement solutions, from implementing, managing, transforming, and all of those elements within public and private sector. So I have been in the procurement area for longer than I care to admit to you here today, and very passionate about procurement. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe. Back to you, Em.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, everyone. So just some technicalities today. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please use your Q&A function on Zoom. So just post any questions that you may have and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. Just a reminder that this is going to be recorded. So if you do drop out, there is going to be a recording sent out. And yes, if you do drop out as well, please also contact me. I've posted my email address in the chat function. And so do email me if you have any difficulties throughout the presentation. And that is all from me. So enjoy the presentation and I'll throw it back to Stefan.
Thanks very much, Em. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Not sure I understand.
So I want to introduce Grosvenor before we get into the content of the webinar today. So those of you who have heard of us would know that we work closely with our clients around improving their procurement functions. We call that Procurement Transformation. Our offering there is quite often linked to improvement in the capability of processes and people capability. And most recently now also with more of a focus on procurement systems, because it is most certainly of interest for organizations all across the country. And we'll talk about today how actually systems can sort of solve or help solve and support solving some of the issues that procurement functions do encounter across the country. We also help clients with high stakes procurement projects. So that's the end-to-end sourcing of contracts. And then when a contract is established and it doesn't quite achieve what it needs to achieve, we also help our clients turn the performance of those contracts around. Next slide, Em, please. Within our procurement systems offering, we work with clients that sort of fall into two different categories. The first category is clients who currently have a technology investment, so they already have some sort of a e-procurement system. Quite often they're not quite happy with that, so they're not quite getting the expected benefits from that system. And what we find is that the initial reaction from those clients is, oh, let's just start again and let's just start from scratch. Unfortunately, those clients then find out within a year or two that they're just at the same position again as they were when they decided to look at the system in the first place. So what we find is quite often the problems are in around how the change was managed and how ready the organization was before the implementation of the system. So what we come in and do is a health check of what currently works with the systems and what doesn't, and we help these clients bridge the gap in between those two. Those clients in the second bucket who currently do not have a technology and do not have a procurement system, we help them from the start to the finish, so from defining the business case through to once the system is live, and the services that we offer for those clients is around change management, and also in making sure that those organizations are actually ready in implementing their e-procurement systems. Thanks very much. So in the next slide, we'll talk about what we're covering in the next half hour or so. So the agenda for today is we want to talk about what are the typical hurdles that procurement teams across the country are facing at the moment. Then we'll talk about e-procurement systems. There's lots of acronyms there, and we just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page about those. We quickly talk about some latest developments in the software market. Then we go into the pitfalls around system implementation, and also what we find for those organizations that do have a current system and are not happy with it, what they can essentially do as well. We'll wrap it up and then have hopefully some time also for a Q&A session. In preparation for that, as we go along, as Em said, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom to post any of those questions that might be burning, and we'll try to get to all of those at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So Grosvenor actually does research every year, and we have been doing that for the last 7 years, around understanding better what the procurement teams across Australia and New Zealand struggle with, and what their sort of current maturity is. In the last iteration last year, we found that there's a couple of hurdles that are quite common across these procurement functions. The first one is that procurement teams say they don't get involved at the right time within the process, and quite often it is too late that they get involved. They're bogged down in transactions and constant firefighting, so not really getting to the strategic bits of procurement. They feel like they don't quite have the people capability that they need to have to execute whatever is in front of them. And also capacity is an issue. Now, out of those top 5, the issue around technology, systems and tools, which is obviously what we want to cover today, only ranks 4th. But when you look at the other 4 in that list, you'll actually quickly find out that, well, all of those other hurdles can actually be at least somewhat addressed through better procurement systems. So we find that e-procurement systems are so interesting for a lot of companies to look at the moment, and companies, I mean private and public sector organizations, because they can actually address a lot of those biggest hurdles that most procurement teams face. Thanks, Em. Now, off to the acronyms, and procurement professionals love the acronyms, and it's no surprise that that's the same with the e-procurement systems as well. Now, I just want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page about what we're talking about today. So when you think of the procurement life cycle, sort of starting at the sourcing stage and then probably ending after an invoice was paid with the spend analytics and new category management initiatives. When we sort of divide that into 2, and the midpoint being where the contract is signed, then from the sourcing to the signed contract, we really find that that is what we call the upstream part of the e-procurement systems. It's commonly also referred to the source to contract part. And then when it comes to paying an invoice, that is then what is referred to the purchase to pay part, or the downstream part of those e-procurement systems. Now, if you take upstream and downstream together, you'll end up with a source to pay system, which is the S2P. So that's just one of the things I wanted to call out. And we actually find The world is rapidly changing, and some of the technologies out there previously only had a P2P functionality, for example. Others only had an S2C functionality. Now they're sort of slowly creeping into each other's territory, and most of the enterprise-grade systems nowadays have the full S2P functionality in there, which is quite important to understand before you make a call on what you want to implement. Now, I'd like to hand over to Jason, who's going to talk to us a bit about the latest developments in the market, just picking up on what I was just saying. Em, can you go to the next slide, please? So, Jason, what are those sort of latest developments in the software market that you have observed?
Thanks, Stefan. I think you just referred to a couple of them, but I guess as a general overview, there's certainly been rapid change in this space. I think in particular over the last 5 years, and that's, you probably argue that's accelerated over the last 2 or 3. One of the ones you mentioned is certainly the expanding functionality that some of the enterprise grade systems are offering. I guess the larger end-to-end platforms, the likes of SAP Ariba, Coupa, have certainly seen, and others have certainly seen additional functionality modules being appended to those platforms in recent times, and that has probably accelerated quite exponentially. In more recent years, I guess things like the addition of data analytics, often enabled by AI and machine learning based systems and technology, supplier risk management modules being added in the source to contract element of the end-to-end, and I guess in the P2P space, a lot of developments there in more automation of payment systems, integration of those with ERP and accounting platforms. So certainly been a trend in recent times is the growth in the functionality of those enterprise grade systems. Certainly another thing, and this isn't unique to procurement technology, has been the increasing cloud-based delivery of solutions, becoming, I guess, the norm, moving away more often from the on-premise. And certainly that has, to some extent anyhow, made implementation a lot simpler for many organisations. I guess in parallel to that, outside of the end-to-end platforms, there's certainly been more lower cost sort of software as a service solutions emerging, again, often delivered via the cloud, that have offered different elements of the end-to-end S2P. So these might be players who are delivering a specific sourcing tool or something that dials into contract or supply management, or maybe something quite niche in the payment space. So again, there's been an increasing number of niche players with particular capability emerging. And I guess what's been happening in parallel to that is, in a lot of instances, the simplification of integrated platforms across the end-to-end value chain, driven by standardization of APIs and other simplified approaches to integration.
Interesting. So the last point here, Jason says end-to-end S2P platforms versus the ecosystem model. So what do you mean by the ecosystem model?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a couple of schools of thought here, and I don't know that one's right, necessarily one is right or one is wrong. Again, there's right answers and wrong answers depending on an organisation's situation, but essentially the ecosystem model is, as I was discussing, finding, I guess, best of breed applications that perhaps deliver 1 or 2 or 3 elements of the end-to-end S2P value chain, and appending those together, integrating those to create an ecosystem of multiple platforms to design and configure a bespoke solution that is best fit for a particular organisation. So I guess that's the ecosystem model. The end-to-end S2P platform is more I guess, going with one partner to deliver that end-to-end functionality within one platform. So again, it's not. I don't believe there's a definitive answer that one is better than the other. It's a case of what does an organisation need, what appetite do they have to do an integration piece, and where and probably more particularly so where are the particular functionality needs, and what are the issues that are trying to be solved by that company in delivering a system.
Perfect. Thanks. Can we go to the next slide, Em? So really the first thing that we find when it comes to the sort of the pitfalls that a lot of organizations, who currently don't have a technology investment, would be well advised to avoid, now talking a bit about the critical success factors of for those organizations that are thinking about putting a new system in place. The first one is obviously really understanding, what is it that we need and what is it that we want, and sort of making a distinction between the two. So Jason, what have you found there when it comes to the specification of that system? What have you found there to be the sort of the call-outs to be?
Yeah, well, I think the broad brush call out is really about framing this sort of project as delivering a solution rather than a system. I guess sometimes the case an organisation becomes a little not obsessed but focused on the technology itself, and sometimes that can mean a drift away from the actual purpose of the system and the solution of that as a whole, and the specific issues that are attempted to be addressed by delivering the platform. So I think the call outs here are, ensure that the overriding philosophy, if you like, of the work is really about solving for organisational and procurement and payment issues that are clear and apparent within the business, and that really the system is a tool to help achieve that. And I think a sound way to approach that is actually put a structured process around this with key business partners, finance and others within the organisation to actually dig into this in some depth and actually articulate and document what are the particular elements of the current value chain around both upstream and downstream, where there are pain points and things that need to be resolved through the delivery of the system, and be quite clear and specific on that. It's really about, this is really about building that specification and clear specification of what the system that you want to go and find and deploy will actually do in terms of delivering to those issues and those challenges. And again, I think it's an important element of getting that spec right, and ensuring that when you take that to market and try and then marry that up with the most appropriate technology platform, that it's a fit for purpose solution that you go and find. I think it's not uncommon sometimes for clients to be dazzled by functionality that really, in many instances, they may actually never need.
So it sounds an awful lot like it's actually not an ICT sort of software procurement exercise. What it actually is, it requires is a quite deep understanding of the procurement processes, systems, and sort of also better practice that's out there in order to be able to really clearly define what is needed, and probably also to leave out what is not needed, not to overcomplicate the system. Sure,
and of course, the technology is fundamental, but it shouldn't be the driver of the work. The driver of the work should be, what are the rules, what are the value adds, what are the issues to be addressed, and what are the benefits that are going to flow from that. I guess the other piece, the last bullet point on the slide here is, and there's two elements to this. It is about understanding current state and what do we want to fix, if you like. But of course, there needs to be some consideration of what is the future likely to look like. So what is the organisation likely to need moving forward? What are the emerging issues in your business, your industry? What are the future requirements or specs, functionality that you believe may be useful in the future within the lifespan of the platform that you're considering to deploy? So you do need to think about that also.
Thanks, Jason. Em, I think we can go to the next slide. Now, you just briefly touched on the stakeholders and the importance of bringing everyone sort of together. But I think it's just worthwhile spending a bit more time on that again, because it's at the end of the day, it's all great to sort of specify a system that works for procurement in itself. But there's obviously a whole raft of other people that will, be impacted by the new system. So how can you make sure that they are all fully engaged in the process?
And I think almost all organisations recognise this, but I think the question is how much emphasis is given to this piece, and how much effort is devoted to actually fully engaging all key stakeholders and taking them on the journey, if you like. Buzzword I don't like to use that much, but it's probably appropriate in this case that key stakeholders are there from very early on and taken through the end-to-end piece. Procurement and finance obviously are almost inevitably key project drivers in a source to pay or a P2P project. I think early alignment between those two functions particularly is fundamental. Fundamental to really make sure that the objectives are well understood of each of those functions, and that there's alignment and a shared view that's formed quite early. And I think what also is important to come out of that engagement is that procurement and finance also jointly map, I guess, the broader stakeholder community within, not just within the organisation, but also external to the organisation, that are going to need to be brought into the project and engaged, and agree a process to drive that, and agree who's going to take the lead with certain stakeholders and who's going to take responsibility for different elements of that stakeholder engagement program. And I think it does need to be looked at as a program, something that is, again, a well-structured, thought-out approach that's monitored and managed and evolved as the project emerges, because inevitably there's complexities that aren't understood at the start of these projects, and they emerge as you go through that, and they emerge as you continue the conversation with stakeholders.
Well, and one point that I quite often, unfortunately, see is sort of missed, one stakeholder group, is the suppliers as well, right? If you want them to be fully on board with your e-procurement solution, because that will actually have a lot of benefits for your organization, right? Consider involving them just as early as the internal stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important call out. I mean, I think often the suppliers are brought into these projects a little too late, when there's probably key decisions have already been made around system configuration and how suppliers are going to be engaged. And I certainly believe there's value to bring suppliers into the early stages of these projects, when thought has been given to functionality and system and process. You don't necessarily need every supplier involved in that, but I think there's certainly value in forming maybe a small working group of key critical strategic suppliers who can be involved in that dialogue, and I guess provide input quite early in the work.
Thanks, Jason. Next slide, please. So the next part really is around that sort of readiness. What I've heard from clients is, they signed a contract with the technology provider, and then the technology provider rocks up on the first day of implementation, and the client feels like they're being hit by a freight train because all of these questions are asked. What does this process map look like? Where is this other document? And how does this actually work? And clients just feel like completely overwhelmed, and they quite often have to go back to the drawing board. So what is it that can be done before that sort of freight train comes to sort of prevent that situation?
Yeah, I think sometimes this is missed altogether, or if it's done perhaps with not the thoroughness and depth that it needs to. I mean, I think a formal and well-structured readiness assessment, and an honest readiness assessment is really a critical precursor to going out and finding the right technology partner. Because again, if this is done well, I think it brings to light and brings to the surface a whole range of issues that are really important considerations in prioritising different system elements and functionality, what is actually achievable, what isn't, what barriers are going to be there to deliver different parts of the technology, whether it be some technology barriers, whether it be some capability barriers within the procurement function, or whether it be appetite for certain elements of system functionality within the organisation. And again, I think completing this readiness assessment is really the starting point to actually building the foundations of the change management program too. It really should bring to light the issues that are, either required to be addressed in advance of delivering the technology platform, or need to be considered as part of the deployment program, or things that will be potentially insurmountable, that will mean parts of the technology really should be parked and maybe considered as a phase 2. So this in my mind is really one of the key, critical, and sometimes overlooked steps.
Fantastic. Now let's look a bit at change management, and that's on the next slide. I look at a lot of tenders that come out of various, especially public sector organizations, really, because they're always public. What they specify in their tender documents often is around, this is the functionality that the system needs to have, and this is how the implementation is going to work, and the like. But quite often the change management aspect has actually not been thought through or even considered. We just heard how important that actually is. So isn't it that the functionality of the systems more or less are the same across the board? Then the actual implementation through the change management becomes critical in trying to address it. Sorry, and that's actually on the slide before. You just got to the next slide. Sorry. Thanks very much. Sorry, Jason, back to you. Talk to us about change management. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I guess in my mind, this is a little like what we were talking about, I think 3 or 4 slides earlier around, this again, I think needs to be one of the overriding philosophies of what these types of projects actually are. Firstly, it's about delivering a solution rather than a system. A system is an enabler of a solution. Likewise, I think it's really important to recognise that these projects are inevitably really a change management task first and foremost, as I think Stefan called out there. I mean, the technology, frankly, isn't going to deliver anything unless there's change alongside that, change in process, change in practice, change in culture sometimes, change in adoption, change in how categories are thought about and addressed, change in support for the system. So there's all sorts of different elements that need to be driven, understood, managed, and delivered alongside the actual technology deployment itself. And certainly I think in looking at a technology partner, considering technology partners, it is an important consideration to also assess the ability of those technology partners to also play their part in the change management. But I think it's also important to recognise that the bulk of the heavy lifting around change really is the responsibility of the broader team, and I guess depending on the capability resources within an organisation, that is usually a combination of an internal team and often a supplementary external deployment partner, and who has good procurement knowledge and know-how and those change management capabilities. And I guess also, I think a common mistake here is to sometimes under-resource and underfund this element of project. And in my mind, it's impossible to underfund and under-resource this element of it.
Perfect. And so this role is the one that makes sure that the business case is fully implemented, and sort of not just implemented the technology, but actually all of the benefits flow through. So that's what the change management task is all about, sort of advocating for the business case.
And connected to that too, I think that the change management program particularly needs to always dial up and connect to the overarching project strategies and the overarching procurement strategy that really should drive what the objectives and deliverables are.
Perfect. Em, next slide, please. So what we just talked about was the sort of what those organizations that currently do not have a procurement system should keep in mind and consider when implementing that new technology, sort of as critical success factors. Those of you in the audience today who already have a technology and you're not quite as happy with it as you would like to be because it's not delivering all of those expected benefits, and in the name of this webinar, sort of not firing on all cylinders, what is it that you can do? Jason, what have you seen those organizations sort of need to do in order to get more of those expected benefits?
Yeah, look, I don't think this is uncommon. I think it is quite common. Platform's been delivered, it's gone live, maybe 6-12 months down the track. You know, the benefits emergence is compared to, I guess, what was forecast in the business case, and you know, quite often there's gaps in there, and you know, sometimes the root cause around that is on a reflection of the implementation program. Maybe some of the key elements of that were missing, or perhaps not given the prominence that they should have. I think, you know, the important message here is all's not lost. You know, I think there is an opportunity, again, with an honest assessment of where you're at and why things aren't perhaps delivering what they should. Why is adoption of the system perhaps not there? Why the benefits that we thought were to emerge aren't. So, you know, again, I think it's important to recognise that you know, these deployments aren't simple. There will often be issues and glitches that are unforeseen until you actually get the system live. And again, so I think to be ready to deal with this sort of situation, it's important that the change management program that's part of the implementation, you know, that there's an overhang in that continues past day one into day two of system delivery, and that there's an approach around continuous improvement and understanding in real time how the system is performing, how adoption is looking, and what benefits are looking like. And again, you know, there's some common things that can happen here. Maybe there's some misalignment between source to contract processes and those that sit in the P2P space. Maybe the stakeholder engagement hasn't been quite as sound as it could have been. And again, I think a critical thing here is if this situation arises, it really needs to be something that's escalated to the senior leadership team within the procurement function, and really, you know, treat this as a strategic matter that requires focus and attention and an effort at a senior level to resolve and remediate.
So to me, really, Jason, it sounds like, you know, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater and blaming the technology or the people who have implemented it. Quite often it's around really understanding the reasons why it is broken and then coming up with a remediation plan of how to fix it. And I know in the summary they do in just a moment, you know, it actually goes again to organization often wasn't ready for implementation, and the change has been poorly managed. So we're sort of now seeing the flip side of what we just talked about as critical success factors. Quite often, if those are not followed during the initial stages of the project of implementing the system, you'll then end up with the benefits not being realized, and you'll sort of have to retrofit some of that.
Correct.
Next slide, and then Jason, probably just wrap up what we've just talked about.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I guess, to summarise in a little number of points, you know, some of the things we've covered. I mean, we've spoken about this in different parts of the slide. Just really important to understand the technology is a means, it's not the end. You know, this is about delivering a solution that connects to issues and strategic objectives. That readiness assessment piece, I think, is critical, and an honest readiness assessment. Don't skirt around issues or sort of brush under the carpet things that are likely to be challenges along the way. Bring those to the surface as early as possible, and determine how you need to address those to have an effective delivery program. And the change management piece, is fundamental. We've spoken to that through a number of the slides. I think important to recognise it isn't easy. Change. Human beings don't necessarily deal with change that well, and inevitably these systems, especially if they're an end-to-end, it is a significant change program, and so it does require a well thought out, resourced program that runs through the entire life and beyond of the system delivery and go live. I guess the maybe doesn't sound like doom and gloom, but it sounds like, wow, this can be a pretty significant task. I suppose the silver lining is you know, and I think this is well observed in the market. If this is done well, you know, the hard work is rewarded. Stefan called out in, I think, one of the first slides, you know, some of the common barriers that procurement teams face in being able to execute their strategies. And, you know, a well-considered, implemented, designed, managed technology platform can really be a game changer for procurement functions, and more importantly, the organisation as a whole, to, you know, really deliver that value.
Thanks very much. So that's interesting, because it does sound like a lot of work, and it's a lot of work up front. So in that sort of whole planning stage, isn't it? So now probably is a good time to sort of loop Joe Bailey back into the discussion as well. Joe, how is this reconciled with some of the marketing material that we're currently seeing from some technology vendors saying they can implement the software within 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is, and then we are hearing that there's a lot of hard work required at the same time. So how do those two sort of marry up?
Sure, Stefan, thanks. Well, how quickly and easily that can happen, well, depends on a few things. One of which, of course, is, well, what's the starting point? Is that pre or post preparation? And obviously Jason's talked a lot about getting that business readiness. So where is that clock getting started from? It also depends on whether an organisation is prepared to accept the vendor's vanilla processes. And I expect this is much easier for corporates than it is for government or for construction related procurements. And then it also depends on your objective. So is it to stand up technology, or is it to achieve an array of business improvements aligned with your policies and with new behaviours embedded across the organisation and the suppliers? So that's not necessarily a very quick journey. If business readiness hasn't been done up front, it can be a long and costly exercise to keep getting the vendors back to make those technology changes as you later identify them and as you become ready to make those improvements that you want to achieve.
So one way of sort of making it faster could be that we're starting with small pieces and not trying to do the whole thing at the same time. So if you were to sort of sequence an implementation, where's best to start, in a source to contract part or in the purchase to pay?
Sure. Well, if you know that you're doing a whole source to pay end-to-end process, it would definitely be more efficient and less expensive to overall to do your S2C first. So you source to contract first, because having your contract set up in place first saves you having to backtrack and adjust things to connect your contracts to the purchasing processes later. So you'll get economies of scale if the vendor can set up a lot of the things up front. For example, your single sign-on and your workflows, and you do that once up front. And then they don't have to do that later when they come back to do the other elements. And from a process perspective, it's always easier to ensure that the expectations and terms required for the vendors to connect and work with your S2C and P2P systems through the sourcing and contracting process, rather than having to negotiate this, mid-contract. So it's important to get the purchasing strategy right before the sourcing and contract processes, because it's not one size fits all. But having said that, if an organisation has implemented already a P2P solution, that doesn't mean that a separate S2C can't later be sourced and aligned over time. But if it's S2P that you're putting in place and you know you're doing that, you'll get the economies if you start with S2C first.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. So now is the time where everyone can sort of ask us some questions as well. Please use that Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen to post some in there. Feel free to address them to one of us or just to post them in general. And that would make it a bit more interactive. So that'd be great. And while everyone is doing that, I've got another one for you, Joe. We heard today about the misalignments between source to contract and P2P systems that quite often do exist in sort of reality that need to be overcome. Where do you typically see those misalignments?
Well, I think that might be a little bit of a myth in terms of that it's always technology that's creating the misalignment. So usually misalignments occur when the purchase and the implementation strategies haven't been established or included as the requirements when you're sourcing. And I'll talk to this because I know it's really quite a bit strategic in respect to suppliers will prefer that you buy through their processes and systems. And I know I'm only talking the P2P for the moment, but it all interlinks. And they'll prefer that you do that for many reasons, and some of which may conflict with your savings targets. So unless you've contracted them to work with your systems and you jointly support the compliance back with your buyers, you will have great difficulty getting traction with your preferred systems. So that's a process thing that we're talking about and a strategy thing that we're talking about that's creating misalignments. Now, from a system perspective, probably the biggest misalignment with indirect spend is trying to get the S2C to integrate with an ERP or trying to use a clunky ERP for your buying transactions. So once a separate P2P solution can vastly, often a separate P2P solution can vastly improve the processes and the productivity, and it solves all the contract spend visibility and reporting needs with much less time and effort as trying to integrate your S2C with the ERP. So that might be a better solution. But back to strategy again, making sure the right P2P solution is deployed for your organisation type and category needs will help ensure that the best user experience for higher contract compliance that in turn achieves your business objectives and supply market confidence. So it's not always about the technology, it's often about your strategy.
Fantastic. Em, I think do we have any questions that came through in the Q&A section?
We just have one now. I will read it out. So, do you find that you have found that the downfall of system implementation is ever related to a lack of day one end user value? Jacob has said, we've seen it all the time. Senior management have grand plans and the system heavily aligns with corporate objectives, but often doesn't actually make the end user's job any easier. Therefore, they find ways around using the system, if using it at all.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think a good call out. And again, I guess there's a few things connected to this around ensuring that the right stakeholders are engaged in the process from start to finish to really consider, well, firstly, what functionality is actually going to deliver value to the business for one, and also I think related to that, well, what are the what are the elements that would make sense to be delivered first, assuming it's technically feasible, where there's going to be most bang for buck in getting those elements of the system live as a priority. And really, where the knowledge and know-how in my mind should be informing that is from the stakeholder groups who are going to be using the platform to buy stuff, largely, assuming we're working in the P2P space, or conversely, if it's sourced to contract, what part of that is really going to deliver to the burning platforms, if there are those within the organisation. And as the questioner called out, I think again sometimes that can be missed, and there's excitement at a platform that's going to go live in a month. Everyone's been working their butts off for 6-12 months, and then sometimes there can be a bit of a deflating experience when the go live buttons hit, and maybe it's an element of the system that perhaps doesn't actually really truly deliver that much value immediately. And it's like any experience, isn't it? First impressions count. And if the first impression of a new system is, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, but doesn't really help me very much, then it can really deflate the user groups, and that can really impact uptake.
Yeah.
Exactly. And sorry, Jo.
Sorry, Stefan. Yeah, that is a great point, because if your processes and your system is not designed with the users and the buyers completely in mind, in which case they have to be there to help you through that process to make sure it's an easier not a more difficult process for them, because if they can't engage with it and if they can't use it and they don't love it, then they're going to find workarounds and your system just will not work from day one. And we've had lots of experience with that in terms of making sure, and quite often you'll think, oh, it's all about making sure it's good for the supplier, and that's often the mindset, or let's make sure it's good for the processes and compliance that we've got to do. And whilst that's important, all of that has to work with the buyer being absolutely number one. And the users that have to use it has to be number one to make their processes much more streamlined. If they don't love it, it won't get used. So that's the absolute most important thing.
Yeah, critical. And I think that Jeff Wells has just put a point in the question in here that connects to that too. And it's, you know, I think it's easy sometimes for both procurement and finance functions to perhaps overestimate how far up in the mindset of user groups they actually are. You know, people assume that, you know, they're just waiting with bated breath for a new procurement system to land with them. Well, frankly, most users across your business aren't. They're too busy doing what they've got to do every day. They're only going to be interested in a system like this if it makes their jobs easier on day one. And if it's not delivering that, then you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, and all of those myths around, oh, we'll sort that out once we're live, that's all there are. Because once it's live, changing it is going to be much less likely than if it's done right from in the first place. That's all we had time for. Em, did you want to wrap up?
Yes. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. If you have any other questions, you have my email, so please feel free to email me. And yes, thank you again.
And then maybe just go to the next slide, Em, which has got
Sorry.
some contact information.
Sorry.
For all of us. I think we'll be distributing this pack, I think, after this session. So, but I know all of us would obviously welcome any follow-up questions or contact that you may wish to have with us.
That's right. I will also send out the link to our new ebook that we recently released. So in case you haven't seen that, definitely leaf through that as well. It does pick up on the most important things that we talked about today as well. And we'd like to thank everyone for their attendance today and really appreciate your time. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Jason. And thanks, Em.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
connecting.